Hey there, and welcome back to MTG Another Look. And if you're new here, welcome and thank you for clicking. MTG Another Look is a channel where we talk about underutilized or otherwise interesting cards for Commander. We also discuss previews, reprints, and sometimes do pack openings, just for a little treat. If you end up enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to really help out the channel. Thanks a lot, everyone. Now let's take another look and get into it. Let's take a look at Ixidron, originally printed in Time Spiral. For 3 and 2 blue, you get an illusion with, as Ixidron enters the battlefield, turn all other non-token creatures face down. They're 2/2 creatures. Ixidron's power and toughness are each equal to the number of face-down creatures on the battlefield. Blue is probably the second worst color when it comes to wrath effects. It has some pretty good mass bounce spells, the best of which is clearly Cyclonic Rift. And most of the time, blue has to rely on mass bounce, some of which is asymmetrical, but most of which isn't, and single targeted removal. It gets by okay with bounce effects, but the problem with bounce is that the creatures you bounce can just be replayed, and then you're back in the same boat as before. But this time, their owners may have even more incentive to attack you. Besides mass bounce, your choices are pretty thin in color. There's the Phasing of Zhalfir and Curse of the Swine, which both are somewhat playable. Both are ways to permanently remove opposing creatures, Curse of the Swine more so since it exiles. Your opponents won't be able to replay those same creatures immediately, but are instead left with 2/2 tokens. Most of the time, trading a 2/2 for what you wanted destroyed is worth it, particularly with Curse of the Swine. Curse does cost significantly more mana if you want to transform several creatures, but it being scalable and it targeting means you will never be in the uncomfortable situation of upgrading opposing creatures that you didn't want to. The Phasing of Zhalfir does have the unfortunate side effect of actually turning your opponent's 1/1 tokens into 2/2 tokens. Since it destroys all creatures and replaces them with 2/2s, it doesn't have the flexibility of choosing what you want to get rid of. Its lower mana cost is a fine trade-off for that inflexibility, and since you get to choose when you play the spell, and also what chapter you want to start on with the Read Ahead ability, you can sometimes navigate around that downside to use it to best effect. Both cards, however, have the downside of being near useless in a situation where one of your opponents has a lot of creatures beating you down, and you don't have blockers. If your opponent has 4 4/4s, these cards will downgrade them a bit and save you some damage, and whatever the abilities the creatures have, but will still leave the opponent with 8 power on board ready to attack you. It barely slows them down and won't protect you from the onslaught. Ixidron is about as powerful as these two cards, but plays a bit differently. It doesn't target like Curse of the Swine, so it can deal with big ward or hexproof creatures, and it doesn't upgrade little tokens like the Phasing of Zhalfir. It also does have the benefit of being a creature that can block your opponent's 2/2s. In the previous scenario, when you're being face down with 4 2/2s, Ixidron won't let them just have a free attack. They can still attack you, but at least you'll be able to block one of your choice to destroy it. And on a board with a lot of creatures that were just turned face down, Ixidron can be massive and the largest threat on the field. Ixidron, being from the original Time Spiral block, has a little bit of a wonky interaction with the rules. The wording on the card says, as Ixidron enters the battlefield, turn face down all non-token creatures. It doesn't say when Ixidron enters the battlefield. That means it works like a clone effect. Clones enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature. It, at no point while it's on the battlefield, is anything other than the creature it copies. Ixidron, similarly, turns things face down while it enters. There is no point where it is on the battlefield when the other creatures are turned face up. That means it won't set off enters the battlefield effects like that of Suture Priest. The Suture Priest will be face down by the time Ixidron enters, so its triggered ability won't trigger. That does mean that an opponent's Elesh Norn Grand Cenobite will not kill the opposing face down creatures, including Ixidron if it's on the battlefield. It also means that Ixidron will not trigger your own Terror of the Peaks, because it will be face down by the time Ixidron enters. It, however, will trigger things like Beast Whisperer, because it triggers when you cast the Ixidron, not when it enters the battlefield. The odd way that Ixidron works within the rules has upsides and downsides in that way. Ixidron in particular is good because it can deal with indestructible creatures, like an Avacyn Angel of Hope. It can deal with hexproof problems like Carnage Tyrant, and since it's not destroying anything, it can trap its victims on the battlefield. That means no reanimating them back immediately. Most protection spells won't save them, unless they phase them out. Ixidron is a pretty reliable removal option for blue that presents a unique problem for your opponents. But maybe more importantly than any of that, it deals with commanders. If an opponent, or all of your opponents, have their commanders on the battlefield, Ixidron can single-handedly trap them on the battlefield. It's so much more valuable to transform commanders than it is to destroy or even exile them. If it's destroyed, a player can immediately replay their commander by paying the commander tax. Ixidron presents removal for their commander, but also gives them another hurdle to jump through. They have to find a way to destroy their commander or bounce it before they can replay it, and in some cases that can take a few turns. Ixidron is a valuable and underrated piece of removal for blue and Simic decks. It has a pretty unique effect that can be a problem for opponents with big boards, or just opponents that are heavily reliant on their commanders. I see most of the decks it's played in are morph decks, like Kadena Slinking Sorcerer, since it serves as a removal and a way to reset your morph and disguise creatures to reuse the abilities. But I think Ixidron has potential in so many more decks. It's just a generically powerful card. Almost any mono blue deck could make use of Ixidron as a wrath that disrupts opposing commanders regardless of synergy. Even a random commander like Thrix the Sudden Storm could make use of it and make it cheaper to cast. Simic decks also have trouble finding useful wrath effects, so it's an option for plenty, like Tatiova Benthic Druid. Anything that wants to slow down opposing creatures and turn off problem abilities can make great use of Ixidron. Next up is Sentinel of the Nameless City. Sentinel of the Nameless City was printed in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. It's a 3/4 Morpholk Warrior Scout that costs 2 and a green. It has Vigilance. Whenever Sentinel of the Nameless City enters the battlefield or attacks, create a map token. It's an artifact with 1, tap, sack this artifact. Target creature you control explores. Activate only as a sorcery. First off, a 3/4 for 3 mana is a decent sized body. It has Vigilance, so it can help gum up the board early to dissuade attackers, while attacking any players that don't have creatures, or only have small creatures early. It's just a great early play to establish board presence. But more importantly, it makes artifact tokens on entry to the battlefield and each time it attacks. These artifacts can be very helpful when it comes to token copying with things like Doubling Season, or triggering artifact entry or leaving the battlefield effects, like with Marionette Master. A free artifact every turn cycle with no mana investment beyond the initial mana cost of the creature is a pretty good deal. Depending on how long it stays in play, it can produce several permanents for the low cost of 3 mana, something that not a lot of cards can do. The map tokens that the Sentinel makes let a creature explore, which is in itself somewhat of a card advantage ability. Exploring is a bit like Surveil, in that it can help you shape your draws by deciding to keep cards on the top or put them into the graveyard. But it does have the added benefit of putting it directly into your hand if it's a land card. A card being put in your hand, even a land, is very beneficial card advantage. They're not dead draws, they're extra value. These map tokens do require a creature and can only be activated at sorcery speed, so they are not just better than Surveil. I don't want to give the wrong impression. But they do cost only a single mana to activate, so any turn you have an extra mana or two, you can put it into these tokens to sculpt your draws, and maybe get some free lands in hand out of the deal, or pump your creatures with counters to continually grow your board presence. Sentinel of the Nameless City goes great in decks that give benefits to your tokens, like Jaheira, Friend of the Forest. It can be used in a Sophia Dogged Detective deck to make artifact fodder to pump your team of dogs. It can also be beneficial in decks that care about sacrificing permanents, or give other benefits when you make any kind of token, like Chatterfang, Squirrel General. Sentinel is a very cheap card that can make a lot of permanents for you. I think it's worth a shot in a lot more decks than just the Merfolk themed decks that it's mostly used in. Next, let's talk about Haven Mind Sensor, originally printed in Future Sight. It costs 2 and a white for a 2/1 Bird Wizard with Flash and Flying. It says, if an opponent would search a library, that player searches the top 4 cards of that library instead. Haven Mind Sensor is a very powerful card that has many uses beyond the stacks decks that it mainly sees play in. It's a lot like Opposition Agent in that it punishes tutor effects and can be flashed in response to a tutor effect in order to catch an opponent off guard. If you look at Aven Mindsensor's EDA track page, most of the commanders it's found in are stacks decks. But if you look at the page for Opposition Agent, it's in a wide variety of decks, most of them not themed around stacks. Opposition Agent is a better card because it provides card advantage on top of hurting tutor effects, but I think Aven Mindsensor should have just as much relevance to the meta that Opposition Agent does, especially with incidental synergies with popular white cards. One of the most common white single target removal spells is Path to Exile, which forces a player to search their library for a basic land card in exchange for exiling their creature. With Aven Mindsensor in play, the path will often turn into a free removal spell, in that they will search just the top 4 cards for a basic, and often fail to find one. Another underrated but very powerful one-sided wrath effect is Winds of Abandon, which is a path to exile for all your opponent's creatures. Normally, it could ramp your opponent's 5 or more lands easily, once for each creature removed. But if you have Aven Mindsensor and cast Winds of Abandon, you'll remove their entire boards, and likely will give each opponent 0 or 1 lands in return. After all, how many basics are they likely to have in the top 4 cards? It can also be used in combination with cards like Tempt with Discovery or Scheming Symmetry to give cards that give your opponent some value, in exchange for even greater value for yourself, a lot more oomph. It's particularly brutal with Marilyn of the Mornsong to hurt your opponent's chances of getting the cards they need. Even without these synergistic removal spells in hand, Aven Mindsensor and cards like it are a valuable inclusion in a lot of decks, considering the prevalence of land ramp spells in the format. I would wager a large majority of green decks play cards like 3 Visits to search their library for lands as their method of ramping. Aven Mindsensor is a card with little opportunity cost that can put a huge hitch in the step of players overly reliant on land ramp instead of mana dorks or mana rocks. Not to mention the more cutthroat decks playing hardcore tutors like Demonic Tutor. Aven Mindsensor can be one of few ways to prevent combo decks from searching for their instant win cards. I think it's worth it to include Aven Mindsensor in a lot more decks because the amount of value it provides on board will be more than what it seems like just from reading it. It can help in generic creature decks like Adeline Resplendent Cathar to keep your opponents from ramping to keep up, or tutoring for their win conditions. It can keep decks with less powerful ramp or payoffs, like Giada Font of Hope, keep opponents from getting out of control quickly, and give you a fighting chance. It's already played in Wynota Joiner of Forces lists to give the deck time to pull off its ruthless strategy. Aven Mindsensor is a card that doesn't need to synergize with anything to give you a lot of help in inhibiting opponents. Next up is a card that Aven Mindsensor would hurt. It's Navigation Orb from Baldur's Gate. It's a 3-mana artifact that taps and sacks for 2 mana to search your library for 2 basic land cards or 2 gates. 1 goes into play tapped, and 1 goes to your hand. In most decks, Navigation Orb is a cultivate that costs 5 total mana split up. Colorless versions of spells almost always cost more mana, but can provide effects in decks that normally don't get it because of their color identities. Blue, black, and red decks have almost no effective way of ramping outside of mana rocks. Mana rocks are extremely vulnerable to mass artifact removal, like Vandal Blast, which is why decks in green, and increasingly in white, prefer to ramp with lands. Navigation Orb is one of a handful of cards that can help decks outside of white and green ramp with lands. Navigation Orb does have gate synergies and is a good option for decks that care about that. It can help you up your number of gates to get your Maze's End alternate win. It's useful in those decks. But I think Navigation Orb is worth serious consideration in decks that have no gates in them. Just being a land ramp piece for colors that don't typically have that option makes your big mana mono black deck more resilient against non-land sweepers. It's going to get you the extra swamps you need to feed Cabal coffers to get your Torment of Hailfire win off. Red decks can use it to ramp and then return the artifact from the graveyard over and over with things like Goblin Engineer for extra card advantage. Blue decks that want to build up the mana to cast Expropriates or other big mana haymakers can make good use of resilient ramp that survives the all too common artifact sweepers. In my opinion, sweepers that wipe out artifacts have gotten so prevalent that you can expect it to happen most games. And because of that, I've been moving away from relying too heavily on faster, but more vulnerable mana rocks. Depending on your meta, it may be worth building your deck to dodge the impact of sweepers. Navigation Orb is worth consideration for lots of decks, big mana or otherwise, as long as you're not in green or maybe white. It works well with Jin Gitaxias, drawing a card because of its mana value and helping to pay for the big spells wanting to be cast in that deck. A Corlash, Heir to Blackblade, or any other monocolor deck with a Cabal coffers likely could use the extra lands in play to fuel it. It can also help in decks that care about land drops outside of green, like Cosima, God of the Voyage. Lastly, I want to bring up Archfiend of Sorrows from Modern Horizons 2. It costs 5 and 2 black for a 4/5 demon with flying. When Archfiend of Sorrows enters the battlefield, creatures your opponents control get -2/-2 until end of turn. It also has Unearth, which costs 3 and 2 black. This is a cheap card that can be a duplicate of a Massacre Worm effect. It can wipe out all small creatures your opponents control on entry, and doesn't affect your own creatures, just like Massacre Worm. Archfiend of Sorrows does have the benefit of fitting into decks that incidentally mill itself, since it can return itself from the graveyard for a turn to get the -2/-2 effect and an attack. There are lots of decks that want to fill as many slots it can with creatures, and look for common deck functions on creature cards, instead of using the normal non-creature spells that would typically fill that role. The Archfiend is a good option to keep in mind for those situations. It, along with Massacre Girl and Massacre Worm, are creature effects that can sweep the board, but also synergize with those decks that need as many creatures as possible. It works great with Massacre Girl Known Killer, since it can help you draw cards when it wipes out enemy creatures. I have a Grenzo Dungeon Warden deck that needed more creature control effects on creatures, and that's how I found this. That deck wants as many creatures as possible to make the activated ability hit more often. It can work for an Arami of the Dead Tide deck. When it's encored from the graveyard, the ETB effects will stack, giving all opposing creatures -6/-6 until end of turn. And decks that incidentally mill, like Sidisi Brood Tyrant, can make use of milling it, and then unearth it to hurt your opponent's boards without killing your own zombies. Thank you for watching, everybody. What do you think about the cards we discussed today? Are these cards diamonds in the rough, or just more rough? Are there any cards you think are hidden gems? Let me know in the comments down below, and give the video a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. I will see you next time, and have a great rest of your day.